Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters from Quilting is My Therapy, and I'm looking forward today to kind of recapping the whole Flora and Foliage challenge, just kind of hit the high points that we've seen over the last 6 months, and of course give you tips and suggestions for quilting the borders of your panel. I know that's been asked a lot, and I'm definitely here to give you my opinion because I happen to be the expert of my opinion. And then I'm going to show you some pictures, show you that, and then I have some questions to answer and some fun announcements. So we're going to get right into the pictures and talk about what we did this challenge. So the end of a challenge is always kind of bittersweet because it's kind of like the culmination of months of work from the time that I start getting the ideas for the panel and the class and then making it all happen and then filming and then chats. When we get to this point, it's always kind of bittersweet. So I'm kind of sad it's over, but don't worry. The live chats will still be going on every week, every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. I am really enjoying this, and I love getting on about a half an hour earlier and chatting via text with some of the viewers. So if you're ever early, you can definitely join that. But let's not get off topic here. In the Flora and Foliage Challenge, I decided to, for the first time, pick designs based on what they look like, not necessarily where they were quilted. So we were kind of focusing on nature-inspired quilting designs. And really, if I'm being honest, it's because I wanted to show wood grain, which is an amazing design, and the paisley feather. So those two are kind of my favorites, and I love that they kind of bookended the series. So in the first video, we saw how to do the wood grain. And even if you aren't quilting along quite yet, maybe you aren't ready, that's fine. But for those of you that have been quilting along, it was so fun to see everybody's quilted samples and to see pictures on the Facebook group, and then also just to hear how much fun everybody was having. And the most important thing with wood grain, if I'm going to sum that whole video up, would be just fill in the blank spots. Even if your lines aren't perfect, it doesn't matter. Just keep it consistent and fill it in. And I really feel like, based on the feedback I was seeing, that most of you quilters were totally getting that. So if you're nervous about it, you have to keep going and keep filling in the space. And remembering that everybody has their own style. Just because my wood grain looks like this doesn't mean that yours will look just like that, but that's all right. We want an edge-to-edge design that's going to fill in the area nice and quickly. And then we talked about how to, kind of make a variation of that design. And every time I teach, whether it's virtually or in person, I love to show variations or different applications of the design to kind of make it a little bit more applicable or kind of more versatile for you. So here we talked about switching it up and using a different filler, and really how you get a neat effect without anything really more difficult. So if you want something to have a pop of texture as opposed to an all over, this was a variation to go with. Well, then we left the wavy, wood grain behind, but we kept the points, and we talked about the leafy meander. We also saw a little tiptoe into thread painting for the first time. I like to kind of test the waters with these little variations because, based on everybody's response on the live chats and on the other places, it's nice to see, like, ooh, is this something people want to learn? Is it not? A lot of interest in thread painting, so we might have to see that in the next challenge. But we kind of talked about getting those points, filling in the area, and using echoing to maneuver around. Remember, if you have any of those gaps or unquilted areas, just fill it in with echo lines or anything that has the same spacing as your main design. It's amazing how much just getting that tip will help you manage those areas on your quilt that can be a little tricky. Now, on the panel, for those of you that quilted along with me on the panel, of course it's not required, but I kind of intentionally gave you these areas that weren't perfectly square. That forced you, in a nice way, to deal with points and irregularly shaped areas. And this is going to help prepare you, or prepare quilters, to use these on actual quilts. If you've ever practiced the design on a piece of fabric and you're like, okay, I got it, and then you put a quilt on and then you start quilting and you're like, I don't got it. I know that's not the correct English, I just love to say it that way. It could be because you're not comfortable using the design in other areas and other spaces. So this is a kind of a good transition into that. In little chunks, not too overwhelming, but just a little bit. Then we went to the flower meander. This one is, for me, a lot of fun to teach. It's very basic in how it goes together, but the texture is amazing. The hardest thing with this design is kind of breaking our preconceived notions as to how we should draw our quilt flowers. Keeping those petals all consistently sized instead of trying to make them touch the line before is usually the trick to make that work. But we also saw how you can replace elements of a design with something else if you find it tricky. So the hardest thing about this particular design is all those changes of direction, right? So as we're going in and out of those pebbles, we're forced to quickly change the direction we're quilting, which is a skill that one would have to learn as they become better at machine quilting. So even if you don't love the feather design, or you're not really into that kind of, feathery, cutesy shape, learning how to manage that change in direction will really help you with other designs. This is one that you can use all over the whole quilt or in different areas to fill in. And again, most important thing is, make sure you fill in all the areas. I'm pretty sure I said that about 1,000,000 times during this video series, and I'm pretty sure I edited out another 1,000,000. But I have to keep reiterating it because it's so important. If you can kind of wrap your mind around that, you'll be doing fine. Now, in the leaf design, we saw echoing as a way to fill in areas, but with this variation, we talked about how to use echoing to highlight or create a different shape. So how does that work if we're still working with an echo line? Well, it all comes down to the spacing. If the echo lines have the same consistent spacing as the rest of the design, it's going to help it blend in and kind of just become part of the texture. But if the echo lines are closer together, it's going to have a contrast in that spacing that's going to help highlight it and show it off. So think of like a set of parentheses around something as opposed to more echo lines. Now this variation, we're echoing each row of those flowers. And what it's doing is it's making a contrast between the petals and that echo line. So again, you can use echoing in a lot of different ways. And even if you don't love the flower design, that's a learning point that you can take away with you. Take away from this, whatever. All right, then we saw pebbles. So I tried to kind of confine this to the smallest part of the quilt, mostly for myself. I love quilting pebbles, but only in little bits. I don't like to quilt pebbles over a whole quilt because you kind of lose the oomph of it. I like to use pebbles kind of like one would use seasoning when they're cooking. Just sprinkle it here or there for a little bit of extra pizzazz. And I knew that I would want to show this later on in the paisley feathers, so it's much easier to introduce a design earlier, get you acquainted with it, instead of hitting you with 2 new designs of the same one. But we talked about, how you can keep them all the same size, but how you can quilt them different sizes if you're wanting a softer texture or you just want this quilt finally frickin' finished, or as I like to say, FFF. And then we talked about, again, the different sizes. So what's so funny or so interesting to kind of witness is that every quilter has a different tendency towards designs. So over the years, as I would teach, I would see that some quilters did better with them all being the same size. Some quilters did better with them all being differently sized. And that's really good because everybody can find what works for them, but it also really helped me learn how to teach this kind of stuff. So if you struggle with the little pebbles, just jump past them and go to the different sized ones and then come back to it. I guess my whole point is, instead of saying all those words, I could say these designs aren't made so that you have to follow progression. It's not like you have to start with one and you have to learn the next and the next to get to it. This isn't math. This isn't something that builds off of it. They're all completely different. So feel free to jump around and find the ones that feel a little bit easier to you. And then as you get comfortable with them, then you can go back to the ones that may be a little bit trickier. And then the elongated swirl. Oh, this design is so great. Again, I used it because I knew it would kind of help when we got to the paisley feathers. It would kind of look familiar and kind of build off of that. But also it's amazing on its own. If you ever see a quilt of mine that has elongated swirls on it, I can guarantee you there's a great chance I was in a rush to finish it because this is such a quick design. Anytime you see a design, if it has a lot of changes of direction, it's going to take longer to quilt. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like driving down a road with a lot of stop signs. There's a lot of stopping and starting and transitioning in and out. But the less changes of direction, the quicker it's going to be to quilt. Sure, there is some changes of direction as I start echoing, but if I quilt those swirls nice and big, I'm going to have a nice straightaway to get it done fast. You can decide how long you want your swirls. You can make them smaller, bigger, because it's not the size of the design that determines the density, it's the spacing between the lines, right? So just remember that. If I'm on my sewing machine, my designs tend to be smaller just because I want to work within my arm space, but on my long arm, I can tend to go a little bit bigger. Doesn't matter, I'm going to keep that spacing. The spacing is going to determine how dense it is. So if I need to finish this, or it's a busier fabric, or I don't really love the person I'm quilting it for, I'm going to spread those lines apart. But if I'm wanting to make it like a filler, I really want it to be dense, then I'm going to squeeze them together. So it's all a subjective thing. It's all up to you and what you think looks good. But then we talked about how you can start dealing with the arrangement or direction of your designs to create an effect. We saw this a little bit in the leaf video. We talked about how you can go in a direction to create, something that frames or draws attention to. But leaf shapes in general, there's really not a right or left. It's the same shape over and over again. We're just kind of pointing it in a direction. But with the swirl chain, for the first time, we saw mirror images, right? So facing one to the left and facing one to the right. This is not difficult, but it does take our mind a second to get used to that mirror image, right? Any design that has that mirror image is usually trickier for quilters to learn. Think ribbon candy is a perfect example of that, or feathers, because I have one going this way and one going that way. Don't get discouraged though, because once it clicks, it'll click and you'll get it. So just keep after it. But the great thing about swirl chain is if they don't face away from each other, who cares? It's still going to look fine. That's just something I like to do. But we're seeing the direction for the first time, facing away from each other, kind of being very intentional about the direction, and then using it to frame elements and to separate areas and divide up big areas of quilting space. And again, just like we saw with the pebbles, some people have an easier time with the elongated swirl all over. Some people have an easier time with the swirl chain. Whichever one seems less likely to make you feel like throwing up, that's probably the one you should start with. So start with one and then kind of transition to the other. They're both so worth learning because they're both fast and can be both used in different ways on your quilts. So I would encourage you, even if it seems tricky, to keep after it because that's a good one to know. And then we saw how what we put in around a design is going to either highlight or hide it. And this is the golden ticket of machine quilting. I like to joke, and I think it's true though, I don't think I'm a better quilter than anybody. I'm just really good at hiding my mistakes. And that's because I quilted for so many customers for so many years. I had to get really good at that. So learning how to highlight or hide elements of your quilting is really going to help you be more satisfied with the end result. So if you remember, we're going to quilt our main element first, whether it's a swirl chain, a feather, whatever it is. And then we're going to take a second and decide how much do I want this to show off? How much do I, want it to be an element of the quilt? How happy am I with how it looks? Right? That's really the kicker. Am I thinking, you know what? I don't know. I don't really love it. I just, was practicing. Then we're going to put similar stuff around it. So something similar density, similar shape, similar direction. So with these swirl chains, I would add more echo lines and more elongated swirls going the same direction until it all goes away. And if you have watched any of my videos or listened to my live chats, you've heard this before, but it's like, keep making mistakes until the mistake goes away. Now, that doesn't work in any other area of life, but definitely with machine quilting. However, if you're like thinking, dang, I did great, I'm awesome, maybe you want to use something with contrast to show off those swirl chains. So contrast just means different shape, different direction, different density. Right? So if I have my swirl chains and I'm like, ooh, I want to show it off, I'm going to use something that's tighter quilted, maybe a back and forth line because it'll have a different direction and a different shape. It's more linear, not so curvy. That's really going to make it pop out. So the good news is, if you've quilted something, you don't have to rip it out if you don't love it. Just keep filling in around it. And if you've quilted something and you're like, dang, I did a great job, then you can use the filler to really make that pop. Well, that brings us to last week's video, the last video in the challenge, the paisley feather. And I kind of liken this to a party trick. If you watched the video or heard my live chat last week, you know this. It looks so much harder than it is, right? Once you start doing it, you're like, oh, this is really fast and really fun. And it's been great to see the comments in the chat about how everybody's like, this is amazing. I'm like, I know, it's so great. So I'm glad that everybody is seeming to like it too. I love this for quilts that I need to quilt quickly, I want a beautiful texture, or I would suggest it for quilters that aren't comfortable quilting regular feathers. There's something intimidating to me about an elegant feather. Now, I feel comfortable with it now, but man, I struggled with those for the longest time when I started quilting. This is a great transition into those elegant, more custom feathers, because I'm still quilting my spine. I'm still making my lines merge into the spine, even though you might not realize that's what you're doing when you quilt your paisley. That's what that is. And we're learning how to kind of wrap around that spine. Once you start transitioning to those more custom, more elegant feathers, you're going to have to learn how to quilt both sides and how to have this, bigger unquilted area. But this is a great transition into it. So if you're thinking like, man, I'll never be able to do feathers, you can do this one. Just keep echoing, 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 and filling it in. And I also touched lightly in the live chat, not on the video, but how you can have direction with this design to create a border design. So really great for bigger borders, especially larger borders with busy fabric. You've made your twin size quilt, but you have a king size bed, so you put that huge border on it. I mean, come on, we've all done that. So this is gonna be perfect because it can fill up those areas and really, really look great. So we learned a lot over that span. From everything from wavy lines to echoing to pebbles. I mean, I feel like I threw a lot at you, and it seems like everybody handled it really well. So if you finish your quilt, I'm super proud of you. And if you're still working on it, keep at it, because I promise it's gonna look great once you're all done. But some of you quilted along with me on the panel and got the optional border kit. Oh, more paisley feathers, more paisley feathers. I'm ahead of myself. So some of you bought the optional panel. Again, this isn't required to do the free motion challenge, but it's always fun to quilt along on the same project. And the last couple challenges, I've had optional borders that you can add to it, because I know some quilters just love borders. So in the next couple minutes, I want to give you some tips or quilting suggestions for that border if you haven't already finished it. I know I've seen some pictures, some people have and did an amazing job, so amazing. But let's zoom in on the border that we're working with. So this is very similar to a pieced border, which is something that you probably will come across once you start quilting. In this particular pieced border, of course it's not actually pieced, I have my flying geese in a row. And so what I always love to do in those triangles is a dot to dot variation, especially for this size. When you're looking at flying geese that are smaller, I'd say anywhere from like 2 to 4 inches, tall or wide, I like to do something like this because it really echoes the shape and it's so fast to quilt. So basically I'm starting from one corner of my triangle and I'm quilting a line that angles up, but it's going to stop about 1/2 of an inch inside the next corner, and then I'm going to go to the opposite side. So I'm going to touch one corner, not touch, and then touch. Now this is a dot to dot design. I did a whole free motion challenge on dot to dot quilting, so you can check that out if you want to see a little bit more about this. But learning a design is one thing, we have to know how to apply it to a quilt. So we have this shape, okay, probably can grasp the concept of it pretty easily, but how do we go from one to one to one? Like how do we go to the next one? So if I were to skip ahead, if you look at the red lines at the bottom, I use traveling to move on to the opposite side or to the next triangle. A question I'm asked a lot is, do I stitch in the ditch or use traveling? And I do. I stitch in the ditch a lot. I love the way it looks, but I also use it as a way to get from block to block to block. So in this instance, I'm using that traveling to get over so that I can then quilt my next block. Now this is going to bring up some questions probably. The questions would be like, okay, well what about the rest of the blocks? The first block that doesn't have traveling around the outside. What about the other side of the second block? I'm not so worried that I always stitch in every single seam. That being said, once I come in and fill around these triangles, I'll incorporate stitching to move my way through it. So just because I haven't stitched down all the seams yet doesn't mean I won't get to most of them eventually. So you can decide how you feel about that. If you're thinking, but I want the back to, I want to be able to see everyone is either quilted or not quilted. If you find that you don't want to travel, I could use the quilting to get to that next point. So if I were doing swirls or something in that background, then I would just use that to get to the next point. Now these triangles are kind of small, but if I had a larger triangle, I could add more and more of those echo lines so that it fills in the area, depending on how dense I want the quilting to be. But since these are fairly small, I'm just going to do one and then continue on. So as I'm going, then I'm going to travel, and it's almost like I'm traveling every other side, if that makes sense. Hopefully you can kind of see that on there. The most important thing is I know where I need to get, and I'm going to get there. I just need to figure out how, whether it's adding quilting or traveling along the seam. All right, so once I have that, What would I do in the background? Well, the background just happens to be the background of the border, the blue part. That just happens to be designed with a continuous wood grain design. The problem is those triangles are kind of in the way. So what I would suggest, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, dang it. This will show you that same dot to dot in the larger triangles. So whether you did touching the points, but you could also go for a different option where you quilt the wedges like I have in the light yellow portion of this block. So there are some variations of dot to dot that will look really cool in these. You just have to determine how much time you want to spend on it and what points you want to show off. If I decide to use those wedges, it's going to draw all the attention to that one point. But if I do that first dot to dot design like that's in the green, it's going to draw attention to the side corners. It just depends on which corners I pieced properly, because I'm not the best piecer. So if I've chopped off a couple points, I need to know how to not draw attention to those. Now I did have a whole how do I quilt it free motion challenge, and we spent a whole week on triangles. So there's some other options you have in that video if you want to go check it out. You can do a continuous curve design. If you want something curvy, let's say you're like, I don't want to do rulers, I don't want to try straight lines, I want to finish this quilt out all curvy, then the continuous curve is a great option. So you can check that. I'll put a link in the description box later that will have links to all these videos, but it's a really good one for triangles. And depending on how big, you can add more or less of those petals in that continuous curve. But the perfect thing about this one is it will move you on to the other side. And then here we see those wedges again. So there's some great options for triangles that size. I almost always do the first one, but there's some different options for you as well. Okay, now the blue background of my border. The problem with this design, and I kind of went back and forth on whether to actually put it on here. The wood grain is continuous, so it looks great, and I love how the flying geese kind of float above it. But as you're filling in between those points, it's going to be tricky to hit those lines, especially when they're really small. Let me encourage you that you don't have to follow the lines perfectly. So in this kind of little bitty spot, I just had a little bit of time, I might try to get as close as I can, but if the lines don't quite hit it, if my quilting doesn't quite hit those lines, or if I skip a little point because it's pretty small, it's going to be fine, I promise. Those white flying geese are going to stand out more than the background quilting, and the density is going to be a little bit different if you quilt it this way, so it won't be super obvious. So I would try to follow the lines as close as possible, knowing that they don't have to be perfectly on the lines. If you're thinking, oh my gosh, that is like way too much to worry about, any kind of all over design, pebbles, swirls, anything we learned during this challenge would be a great thing to use, because we've already used it somewhere else in the quilt and it's just going to kind of have a little bit of repetitiveness to it. All right, but what about the blocks, the little star blocks? How are we going to quilt those? Well, I'm going to still go with a dot to dot design, especially because these are smaller stars. If this was an Ohio star and it was bigger and I had plenty of room to fill it in, I might do something different, but these are fairly small. I don't want to put anything too fussy in them because I don't want to draw attention to that. The star of this quilt is the center. So I'm going to do a dot to dot variation. So this particular variation, I am going to go from the points of the star. So remember that, it's always going to start at the point. So starting at one point, quilting to the center, wherever that center is, I can mark it if I want to, and then quilt on up to the next star point. So basically a V in that area. So now I have two of my star points hit. I need to get to the next one. Can you guess how I'm going to do that? Traveling. So again, using traveling to maneuver my way around the area to get me to the next star point so I can repeat, quilting a line to the center and out to the next star point. And then doing that, I will work my way around that whole quilt or that whole block. This is going to help, kind of give it that angular design. It's going to be quick, no marking, and it's just going to work great in those smaller blocks. Now this is something I've used in star blocks before. So this is a quilt I did for Tula Pink. Those stars, it can be tricky to figure out how to deal with diamonds or groupings like that. So this is what I did, basic idea here. I just added a little bit more embellishment. So as I was quilting the lines, sometimes I added more dot to dot, sometimes I left it, but I'm still going to the points and then to the center and then to the points. So you can really kind of make this as complex or as basic as you like. Now that's just my suggestions. Again, I'm only the expert of my opinion. Sorry. Gosh, I keep getting ahead of myself. For the background part of the star, I might echo around the outside of the star and then just do some kind of filler. Something similar maybe to what I was doing in the other area. And I'm so sorry, I would probably change thread color here, especially if I was using navy in the rest of it. So I don't like to do that all the time because I don't want to make you have to change thread colors, but You could use navy over it, no problem, but I generally tend to not use darker thread on lighter fabrics. You can wrestle with that and find what you think looks good. All right, so those are just my suggestions for quilting the borders of this particular quilt, but I do have a whole challenge called Borders and Backgrounds with some different options. What I like to do when I'm deciding how to quilt something or quilt the borders is, do I want the borders to be a focal part of the quilt? Is it like a frame? Do I want to do some really elegant quilting there, something really neat because maybe the center is just like not as crazy. Maybe it's just I don't want to say a basic quilt, but nothing complex. Then I'm going to do something that has a little bit more attention to it. But if the center of the quilt is the star, shoot, then there's no reason to do complex stuff in the borders. And so one of my favorite go-to designs is in this gray border, that wavy. And so that's in the video tutorial as well, or even some nice echo lines echoing the side. So that's a couple different options. And then you can see there's even some different, you can do some arcs or maybe some serpentine lines. But the main idea is I want to not do anything too crazy in the border if the center is the focus. So if I'm quilting a quilt for Judy Niemeyer with her paper-pieced amazingness quilts, the borders don't really need anything in it because that's the center's to shine. But if I've done a layer cake quilt and I'm like, oh, I can do a little bit something more complex in the borders. So hopefully that helps kind of demystify a little bit of what I'm thinking about when quilting the borders. Ultimately, whatever you do is going to look great. Just keep it consistent, fill in the spaces, and then move on. Another thing you could do is also, if you haven't already quilted the rest of the quilt, you can just use the quilting to kind of go right into the borders and treat it like part of the quilt. It would still look good too as well. So hopefully that helps. Now there were just a few questions, not a whole lot, so I'll address those real quick and then talk about announcements. First question, will there be a quilt label for this challenge? So last challenge I did have a quilt label. This one I will have one also. I just haven't got it out yet. I'm trying to get that done by next week. So if you want a custom label, just keep your eye out for that. I like to joke that my favorite label is a Sharpie to the back of the quilt, but I know that some of us like to, have it properly labeled. You can definitely just keep your eyes out for that if you're interested in it. Okay, great question. L. Huey asked, do I personally find time to learn new free motion quilting designs, and where do my creative ideas come from? I think every time you work on a quilt, you are learning new designs or you're practicing. And most of my ideas come from actually quilting. One of the great things about quilting for customers all those years ago is I got to quilt quilts that I would never piece, for good or for bad. And I got to learn how to deal with different scenarios that I never would have come across because I wouldn't have made those quilts. So that really helped me. But I will tell you, now that I don't quilt for customers, I get so much of my inspiration from teaching, especially when it wasn't COVID and I could travel. Even just seeing students' variations that they quilt, the ideas that they come up with, really kind of like, oh, that sounds fun. So I do find time to practice. It just tends to always be when I'm quilting a quilt. And my creative ideas really come from the application of designs, because you're going to make mistakes. I can't tell you how many times a mistake turned out to be a variation that I ended up teaching in one of my classes. So I love machine quilting, and I definitely make time to quilt. So that was a really, really good question. Another question was about the pillow panel for the challenge. So for the first time I had smaller panels because through feedback, I know that some people were just so scared to quilt the bigger ones. And some people were asking, how do we quilt this pillow panel? I'm gonna do a separate video tutorial for that. That should be out in the next couple weeks. So stay tuned for that. One question that came out was, when I started quilting, my borders were nice and flat. And now that the center is all quilted, they're puckering up, like the borders are wavy. What can I do to avoid that? So a couple things. If it's stabilized, you want to make sure it's basted well. So especially if you know you're going to leave a big section till the last, maybe those get a little bit more pins or a little bit more stabilized than the rest. You could even do some basting stitches. But also know that quilting tends to suck up, or kind of tends to bring in the fabric. So the reason that those borders are kind of puckering is because the center has been kind of shrunk a little bit from the quilting. So know that once you start adding your quilting in the borders, it will start kind of shrinking into that as well. But if you're worried about tucks, don't be, right? So the border fabric is busier, it's darker, you're not going to see any tucks if there is some, and once you wash it, they all go away. So try not to worry too much about that. But that was a good question. I hadn't thought about talking about that. All right. Anne had a great question about quilting in general. She said she's just learning how to free motion quilt, but she keeps breaking needles. Why is that? Well, that is not good. If you're continually breaking needles, it could be a couple different things. First of all, like, are you breaking needles because you're hitting your foot? So one thing that I've noticed is that the faster I machine quilt, sometimes my foot starts to wiggle loose. And if I'm not paying attention, that thing just kind of wiggles all over the place. So I constantly have to make sure it's tightened. If it's just breaking as you're quilting, it could be that you're putting too much pressure on that quilt, quilting too slow. What that means is the needle is more in the quilt sandwich, but then you're moving it, so it's just kind of bending it. But I would also really suggest the superior top stitch needles. They're titanium coated, so they're stronger, and they can really handle that. If you're using the good needles and you're like, I still don't know why, I would be really interested to know if you're dealing with a quilt with big, bulky borders or seams, if that's lending a problem, but you should not be breaking needles on the regular when you're just free motion quilting. So, and I hope that helps. If it doesn't, leave a comment below, or anybody that has suggestions, leave it in the comments after this live chat is over. I'd love to hear what other suggestions people have. Okay, how about some announcements? Live chats will continue. We're not going to stop doing them just because the challenge is over. And next week's live chat is going to be, how do you know whether you need a high shank machine quilting ruler or a low shank machine quilting ruler? Because I'll be announcing some of my brand new low shank rulers with Creative Grids. So this is something I have been promising for a while, but next week we'll have all my rulers will be available as low shank rulers. So super excited about that. So definitely join me for that chat. Another thing that's not online, it's in person. I don't know if you know this, but I'm located in Liberty, Missouri, just a couple miles north of Kansas City, and only about 45 minutes from Missouri Star Quilting Company. And in June, we're having a quilt walk. So June 26th, if you happen to find yourself in the area, we're going to be having our 4th annual quilt walk, where each participating business will hand out a free block pattern, and you can get the free pattern on how to assemble it, and lots of fun sales and events. So if you happen to be in the area, I hope you can make it. We have so many people that join live chats from overseas, so obviously I know not everybody can, but for those of you that are close, maybe you can. All right, so a lot of stuff we went over, a lot of announcements. Hey, if you've liked any of the challenge videos or any of the live chats, I hope you'll continue to watch them. I also hope that you will like the video. That helps more quilters find them, find the videos. And I'm real quick going to pop over and see if there's any good questions. Okay, Giselle asked a great one. How important is a stitch regulator? My stitches are improving with practice, but I'm wondering if a regulator will help. So a stitch regulator is nice if you want all your stitches to be the same length. And it's also pretty nice when you're learning how to quilt, because as you're moving not as consistently because you're newer, it's harder to keep, consistent movement, so you get more shredding thread. But I learned without a stitch regulator, and I don't use one on my sewing machine. So it's not impossible to learn without one. It's just a different experience. If you're already learning without one and you didn't want to, you're like, they're getting better, just go with it. I don't think you have to have a stitch regulator. So if your machine has one, great. If it doesn't, I think you can still learn without it. So I know that's not the best answer, Giselle, but just know, yeah, it'll be fine. Great question. Beverly said, I've seen that some people mist water on the puckers and then let it dry overnight. It kind of shrinks the fabric. Yes. So with those wavy borders, there are a lot of creative quilting options that you have with quilts that aren't perfectly flat. That's, again, another benefit of quilting for customers. Quilting all those quilts that were pieced with love. So yeah, so misting it, I know some people will starch their quilts. Some people will kind of like manipulate it. I'm more of a manipulator, right? So I'll kind of use my hand to ease it in and out. Just remember, if the fabric doesn't fold on top of itself, it's not a tuck, even if it kind of comes close. So just remember that. All right. Okay, just see if there's any question. Oh yeah, Beverly said I use the extra stars and piece them into the backing and use one for a label. So for the first time, the border panel had some bonus blocks. So I thought that was kind of fun. All right, everybody, this has been a great challenge. I promise more chats coming. We're still going to keep this going. And then I will look forward to announcing the next challenge as soon as it's ready. There's been a lot of interest in thread painting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So leave a comment on this video telling me what you'd like to see in a future challenge. And you never know, it just might be the topic of conversation for that. So, all right, everybody, stay safe. And I will see you next week where we'll talk about machine quilting rulers. Until then, happy quilting.